Welcome into CBS News 24/7. I'm Elizabeth Cook. After 19 months in the hands of Hamas, American Edan Alexander is now free. He was released just a short time ago in a handover to the Red Cross at the Gazan border. Now, the dual U.S.-Israeli citizen was released in a deal aimed at getting a ceasefire in the conflict and resuming delivery of aid into Gaza. It is believed there are 24 remaining living hostages of the original 251 taken by Hamas in its attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023. Alexander, who is now 21 years old, grew up in New Jersey before moving to Israel, where he was serving in the Israeli military when he was abducted during the Hamas-orchestrated attack that sparked the war in Gaza. Hundreds there cheering at a watch party for Alexander's release. Family, friends, and supporters. A huge screen was set up for the crowd, showing Israeli news coverage of that release. Crowds began gathering early this morning as word spread of Alexander's impending release. Now, the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, just released a statement on Edan Alexander's release. It says in part, quote, "The returning hostage has just been transferred to IDF forces in the Gaza Strip. The returning hostage is currently being accompanied by IDF Special Forces on his return to Israeli territory, where he will then undergo an initial medical assessment and meet with his family." All right, for how this is all playing out over at the White House, let's go to CBS News White House reporter Willie James Imman. Willie, great to be with you. President Trump has been teasing the release of Edan Alexander for days now, including just hours before the actual release. How did his administration secure this moment?
Yeah, that's right, Liz, and happy Monday to you. Well, certainly welcome news for Alexander's family, Mr. Alexander's family, with his release. The president talked about this earlier today. We know that Steve Witkoff, his special envoy, was in the region, currently still in the region, to receive Mr. Alexander and to check about his condition. We know that the White House has been really pushing for not only the release of Edan Alexander, but also the release of the remains of the Americans who have been held by Hamas. The president touched on that earlier, talking about how the families have really advocated for the release, even expressing personal pleas directly to him, also to his national security team. We know that that has happened not only with the Biden administration, but with the Trump administration as well. We have seen the families come here time and time again to advocate for the release of the remaining hostages. I do want to bring up a post from the president himself that he posted just a while ago. He said, "Edan Alexander, the last living American hostage, is being released." He goes on to say congratulations to his wonderful parents, family, and friends. We know, of course, that the president is headed to the Middle East. Certainly conversations surrounding a more lasting ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas will be a top conversation with the leaders in the region that the president meets. He's going to travel to 3 different nations: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates over the next couple of days, Liz.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about this 4-day trip, Willie. I mean, you mentioned Qatar is on the list, and that country recently gifted the president a plane that he says he will use as Air Force One. I can imagine there are some limitations, legal limitations, to gifts of this magnitude. And I know he's getting some criticism on both sides of the aisle for this.
Yeah, this raised a lot of eyebrows as we reported this story out yesterday. And now the jet itself is 747-8 for those aviation enthusiasts out there, is a more updated modern version of the 747 that traditionally travels with the president, that the president travels aboard on those long distance flights. So that's the bigger jet with the 4 engines essentially there. This would be a more modern version of that plane. The president has really blasted Boeing for delays of the new Air Force One. That certainly won't come to fruition anytime soon. And this jet that the Qatari royal family has donated, says they will donate. Now, Qatar is actually saying, look, this is still under consideration. No decision has been made yet. They released that statement when I asked them about the situation. But the president himself is pushing back against this notion about this multi-million-dollar gift. Listen to what he said a little bit earlier.
Has Qatar asked for anything in exchange for that $400 million luxury jumbo jet? And how can the American people be so sure that they will not in the future?
Well, I think what happens with the plane is that, we're very disappointed that it's taken Boeing so long to build a new Air Force One. We have an Air Force One that's 40 years old. And if you take a look at that compared to the new plane of the equivalent, stature at the time, it's not even the same ballgame. I could be a stupid person and say, oh, no, we don't want a free plane. We give free things out. We'll take one, too. And it helps us out because, again, we're talking about we have 40-year-old aircraft. The money we spend, the maintenance we spend on those planes to keep them tippy-top is astronomical. You wouldn't even believe it. So I think it's a great gesture from Qatar.
Now, the reason why the president is talking about the money we spend on these planes is so astronomical is because of the amount of money it takes to secure these planes. And they're specially modified jets. They're not like the 747s, the commercial jets. Although they're similar, but there's so many modifications that go into essentially making this the White House of the sky. And the president wouldn't be able to fly this jet back home. In fact, he's not doing so on this trip because it would need to be modified. It would need to be checked if it indeed does transfer to from the Qataris to the Department of Defense. So it will be quite a lengthy amount of time. But in terms of the legality of this, the White House says that they're going to follow the law. They're saying essentially that they're still going through the legal process with this. The emoluments clause essentially says that you cannot accept a gift from a foreign power without permission from Congress. So members of Congress have been saying that you need the permission from them to be able to accept this type of gift, especially what would essentially be the largest and most expensive gift any president has received in American history, Liz.
And another big headline we're keeping an eye on today, Willie, the U.S. reached a significant trade deal with China over the weekend, just in the past several hours. How does Team Trump get this deal to hold beyond the 90 days that was agreed upon?
Yeah, there was a lot of news over the weekend, and we know that those meetings concluded. That two-day meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, with the president's delegation, Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent and Jamieson Greer, the U.S. trade representative, meeting with Chinese officials, coming to this essentially an agreement to continue discussions. It's a 90-day deal. The White House is calling this a trade deal, but it's important to point out that they still have to work out some of the details of this. For now, at least, those tariff rates are coming down. The U.S. tariff rate going down from 145% to 30%. The Chinese tariff rate going on U.S. goods imported to China going from 125 to 10%. The U.S. says that 10% baseline tariff is still in play. That 20% fentanyl tariff is still in place. So that's how you get the 30%. But still, nonetheless, they still have to work out these deals. The U.S. delegation, and in this joint statement, I should say, that the Chinese are going to bring down some of those non-monetary trade barriers to U.S. to that essentially restrict U.S. goods going into China. But there are a lot of details that have to be worked out here to come to a final agreement. But this at least sets the stage and the groundwork for those conversations to continue. And President Trump has noted that, of course, he wants a deal. But it's anyone's guess as to what could potentially happen if this deal falls apart. We could see those rates go back up, though, Liz.
Willie James Inman, always great to start off the week with you, sir. All right, let's take a live look at the big board because markets are very happy about this proposed deal with U.S. and China. The markets are surging today with that temporary trade agreement. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer made the announcement from Switzerland after a weekend of marathon negotiations. CBS News foreign correspondent Anna Corin is following reaction out of China to these tariff rollbacks.
Well, there's a great deal of optimism following the joint announcement between the US and China after weekend talks in Geneva. But it is important we put this into perspective. This is a reprieve and not a trade deal. This 90-day pause on the prohibitive tariffs that brought trade between the US and China to a halt and seriously disrupted global supply chains will see the US dropping its 145% tariffs on China to 30%. While China will reduce its retaliatory tariffs of 125% to 10%. Well, China has also agreed to remove some US companies from its blacklist, but not all, and questions remain on China's ban of rare earths to the United States. Well, the markets have rallied. I've spoken to some economists who say the damage from the trade war chaos over the past few months is going to be felt especially for US companies and US consumers. Those cancellations of US orders are already in the system, which means in the next few months, despite this pause, there will be a shortage of goods on US shelves. Some also see this as President Trump caving in, that he didn't have the stomach for the pain to correct international trade imbalances, which he believes disadvantage the United States. Well, China has been preparing for this moment since the first Trump administration, and this recent episode reaffirms China's push for self-reliance and self-sufficiency. Well, as you can imagine, Chinese suppliers are very relieved. I spoke to one businessman, a candy manufacturer. The US is his biggest export market, and he said this is good news. Everything can start running again. I also spoke to a businesswoman that we did a story on a few months ago who makes insulated water bottles, and she said, quote, "This is such great news. Today is truly a day worth celebrating. My American clients informed me that production and shipping can proceed. I will open a bottle of champagne tonight." While the champagne corks may be popping, the effects of the last 6 weeks since Liberation Day are going to be felt for some time to come. In the midst of all this, a real trade deal needs to be negotiated. Back to you.
Anna, thank you so much. All right, let's bring in Javier Dvid. He's a business contributor for CBS News and the business editor at Dallas Morning News. Javier, great to see you. How impactful is this temporary agreement to the economy of both countries?
Yeah, look, this was a bad news story for everyone involved, the U.S. and China, which incidentally had stopped issuing key data that was tracked by the markets. And also people have this tendency to believe, because we're always watching the markets and Wall Street's doing, that this was a big business story or an investor story. Investors are certainly cheering the results, but this is being felt at the smallest levels of business, particularly retailers. We, the Dallas Morning News, we've been doing a lot of reporting about this, and a lot of coverage, and a lot of mainstream businesses that are exposed to China in ways that they're not able to absorb or manage the way an Amazon or a Walmart or an Apple can. So a lot of them were pleading for the administration to reserve a sort of reverse course, because this was a real peril for the holiday retail season. So overall, this is a good short-term news story for supply chains. There were these real fears of shortages and empty shelves, and these anecdotes over the last few weeks that have been accumulating about ships either sitting idle in U.S. ports or empty cargo vessels leaving mainland China. That would have left a lot of sort of bare shelves and put upward pressure on prices that people stockpiled. So again, in the short term, good news, but as it's been indicated, this is a reprieve and not a resolution.
Right. And I'm curious, is this potential agreement here, this 90-day sort of agreement, is this going to have any impact on interest rates, do you think?
Well, this is it. I've said it 1,000 times, I'll say it again. Ignore stocks. Watch what's happening in the bond market and bond yields. Wall Street hated these tariffs from day one. What we're seeing today is a relief rally of the highest order. It's clear that's what's happening. But bonds are telling you a different story. And it's considerably more skeptical than the narrative that's being embraced by the stock market and Wall Street investors. And one analyst I follow noted in his morning newsletter, he said the bond market isn't cooperating with Trump or the Fed. Long-term yields are still relatively high, higher than they were before Liberation Day. So that tells you something. It tells you that interest rates are still pricing in more risk. This is a real problem for the Fed, and it's a real problem for the president, because those rates trickle down to all sorts of consumer-facing goods and services, mainly borrowing costs like credit cards, auto loans, mortgage and refinancing rates, which are still kind of hovering uncomfortably close to 7%.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up auto loans, because I'm curious how a potential agreement with China could impact other agreements, say with Canada, another big trading partner with us.
Well, what ends up happening is Canada had some very interesting data that they released last week, in that while imports to the United States had basically come to a crashing halt, they compensated for it elsewhere. They basically were just selling their goods to other countries. So that's some of what we saw in China as well. Some of their stuff that would normally come here to the United States, they basically just compensated, at least in part, just by selling to other countries or companies. So that's the whole risk of this. We need clarity, and the market needs clarity, and investors and businesses need clarity. if you have your trading partners kind of offsetting what they would sell to you by selling to someone else, it's not a good story. And it certainly doesn't accomplish the goal that the administration wants, which is to turn the U.S. into this mercantilistic powerhouse for manufacturing. You're not going to get there this way.
All right, Javier Dvid, thank you so much for that insight.
Sure.
All right, as we take you out, we're looking live at a crowd gathered in Tenafly, New Jersey. That's the hometown of Edan Alexander, the American held hostage by Hamas, who was just released today. We'll have the very latest on his release. You're watching CBS News 24/7. Welcome back to CBS News 24/7. Top military leaders from Pakistan and India will meet later today to discuss the next steps after reaching a ceasefire this weekend. The U.S. brokered ceasefire seems to be holding for now. Border strikes and shelling have stopped, but India says they've only suspended their military action and are ready to strike in case of another terror attack. Let's go to CBS News correspondent Chanel Call, who's been following this story from our newsroom. You've been following this for the past several days. Chanel, what's the very latest on the ceasefire agreement?
Yeah, since this all kind of erupted on April 22nd, and it is still a very fluid situation, Liz. So let's recap for you and our viewers what happened this past weekend. Just hours after the two sides had agreed to a ceasefire on Saturday, explosions reportedly rang out in border cities and towns. We saw artillery fire and attack drones in Jammu and Kashmir. This, Liz, very much the center of the fighting. Some of the cities there were also under a blackout, I should mention. India, we know, accuses Pakistan of violating that pact, while Pakistan's foreign ministry had said the country was committed to the ceasefire. Now, things seemed to calm down by Saturday afternoon, our time. For the last 36 hours or so, it has been quiet on both sides of the border. Then this morning, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi addressed the nation, saying that India has only paused its military action, also saying that it will retaliate on its own terms if there's any future terror attack on the country. He also notably, Liz, says India will not tolerate any, quote, nuclear blackmail. And this is key because we know both India and Pakistan are nuclear armed nations. President Trump, who, by the way, actually shared the news of the India-Pakistan ceasefire deal before the leaders of those countries did this past weekend, today took credit for the breakthrough.
On Saturday, my administration helped broker a full and immediate ceasefire, I think a permanent one, between India and Pakistan, ending a dangerous conflict of two nations with lots of nuclear weapons. And they were going at it hot and heavy, and it was seemingly not going to stop. We stopped the nuclear conflict. I think it could have been a bad nuclear war. Millions of people could have been killed, so I'm very proud of that.
And remember, Liz, these are two countries that have a very long history of fighting. But this recent spate started on April 22nd. That was when, of course, 26 people were killed in a terror attack on Hindu tourists in Kashmir. India has said Pakistan was behind that attack. And then 2 weeks later, India attacked what it said was terrorist infrastructure inside Pakistan, which then, of course, prompted days of cross-border fighting. This has been, by the way, the worst fighting between India and Pakistan in almost 3 decades.
CBS News correspondent Chanel Call, thank you so much for reporting on this. Well, 5 people are dead in Milwaukee after residents were forced to jump from the windows of a burning apartment building. That fire broke out yesterday, leaving some people trapped inside their units. The fire so intense, firefighters had to crawl on their hands and knees just to get inside the building and then drag people out.
Our firefighters ascending from the 2nd floor to the 3rd floor were fighting fire blowing down the stairwell at them. If you know anything about fire, it doesn't normally travel downward.
I went up to the 3rd floor. I smelled smoke. I grabbed the fire extinguisher. I attempted to put it out, but it was way too totally engulfed. So then I came down and called 911 and started knocking on doors to get people out.
There was so much smoke. I climbed out the courtyard with my cat in a backpack, jumped to the ground floor and ran out.
Firefighters rescued about 30 people. In the end, about 200 people were displaced from the 85-unit building. The cause still under investigation, and the fire chief says the building wasn't required to have a sprinkler system because of the year it was built. Moving now over to New Jersey, where a criminal investigation is underway after 2 people were killed in a house explosion and a fire. Happened early Sunday morning in Washington Township, that's about 20 miles south of Philadelphia. When authorities arrived, a home was fully engulfed in flames, and then the fire spread next door. Take a listen to neighbors describe their initial reaction to the explosion.
It just jolted you. It was a big, I've never experienced that before. It was a huge explosion. A 92-year-old mother screamed, and I grabbed my dog and I grabbed my husband, and we ran out of the house and we got in the car.
Now, authorities say they don't believe this was an accident, but they do add there is no threat to the community right now. No one else was injured. All right, we'll have the very latest on Ukraine as Russia continues its drone attacks despite calls for a ceasefire. We'll dig into this story when we come back right here on CBS News 24/7. Welcome back. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that he is heading to Turkey this week, and he's calling on Russian President Vladimir Putin to meet him there for ceasefire talks. Zelensky posted on X saying he spoke with newly elected Pope Leo XIV over the weekend, and he says he told the pontiff that Ukraine wants to end the war and is awaiting Russia's response. The Kremlin has agreed to talks, but has not said if Putin will actually be there in person. Meanwhile, President Trump took to social media yesterday, urging both sides to start talks to end this war. It all comes after the Kremlin rejected an unconditional 30-day ceasefire in the 3-year-long war. The president had this to say before leaving for his Middle East trip.
Thursday's meeting with Russia and Ukraine is very important. I was very insistent that that meeting take place. I think good things can come out of that meeting. Stop the bloodshed of the horrible. It's a bloodbath. But that 5,000 more, it's really much more, I'm trying to be conservative, more than 5,000 soldiers. Russian, they're not American soldiers, they're from Russia, they're from Ukraine, but they're people. They're human souls, and they're being killed at levels that we haven't seen since the Second World War. And it's every week. A lot of drone fighting. It's a whole new form of warfare, and it's violent and vicious.
Okay, let's turn now to Yulia Joja, the European security professor at Georgetown University. Professor Joja, thank you so much for being with us. Let's talk about the timing of these talks. Ukraine says Russia launched more drone strikes overnight. Is Russia ready for peace?
Thanks for having me, Liz. First of all, it's great to be with you. I would say no. Short answer is no, because we've seen over the last 3.5 years almost how there's been numerous calls from the West, both the United States and European allies, for Russia to stop the war. This is how the war could stop if Russia would stop invading Ukraine. And yet this has not happened. And ever since, we've seen multiple calls from the American side, from President Trump, to sit down for negotiations, for ceasefire, for a peace process. All we've been seeing from the Russian side is stalling. And so now the Europeans have given an ultimatum for Russia to, for both sides really, to have a ceasefire of 30 days, unconditional. This offer expires in a few hours, and yet Russia hasn't even, in the latest statement of President Putin, hasn't even made a reference to that. They might be showing up, the Russians, in Turkey on Thursday, where President Zelensky will be present, but that doesn't mean we'll see significant progress there.
Yeah, what are the odds that Putin is going to meet face-to-face with President Zelensky, do you think, in the coming days?
Pretty slim. We have to understand that on the Russian side, there just isn't enough incentive to stop the war. We have imposed ample sanctions. The sanctions are still standing, but that has not been a sufficient deterrent for Russia to stop or even slow down the killing. President Trump has referred also to the drone war. I'll give you an example of what that looks like on the front lines. One of the major cities he's on the front lines is Kherson. It was under occupation. Right now, people in Kherson are too afraid to go to the end of the block to pick up dead bodies that are lying there killed by drones, because other drones are trying to come for them to kill them as they're trying to pick up bodies. That's how bad it is. And that's all Russia's war on the front lines. We just don't see it anymore that much in the news because we've moved on and there's so many other conflicts in the news cycle.
Yeah, and going back to kind of the U.S.'s involvement in all of this, Yulia, President Trump has been both optimistic and also skeptical of these talks. What role would the U.S. play in a potential meeting between Zelensky and the Russians, if not Putin?
Yeah, we've seen President Trump actually in the last few hours alluding to or referencing the fact that he might be going to Istanbul to oversee these negotiations. And what is here most important to realize is that the United States is the ultimate deterrent here, is the ultimate decision maker, because the United States provides the Western leadership that enables Ukraine to survive. European allies are helping significantly, but it is only U.S. security guarantees and U.S. military might that helps Ukraine going. And so it's only the United States, as things are standing, that can put down the foot, so to speak, and push Russia together with allies, push Russia to the negotiating table. But in my assessment, that will mean more sanctions, more secondary sanctions, to have enough of a deterrent to determine Russia that there's no other way than to agree to ceasefire negotiations, at least.
Before you go, Yulia, one of the big bargaining chips with all this has been who controls Crimea. If indeed the Russians will take Crimea as part of the ceasefire negotiations, does that open the door for years down the road for Russia to try this again and try to take even more control of other areas if, in fact, they won this part of the war?
Absolutely, Liz. Actually, the war has not started in 2022. It has started in 2014 when Russia illegally annexed Crimea. And Crimea is just geostrategically very important. Who is in Crimea really dominates the region, the Black Sea region. And the fact that the Russians are now have seized Crimea and are based there has disabled Ukraine from developing economically and continuing their exports of both industrial as well as agricultural products. So if we don't enable Ukraine towards a just peace, including having Crimea, this will mean that in the long term, this is going to cost us, the United States and European allies, because this disables Ukraine from sustainable development through exports, and that will mean that we will need to help them more financially. So it's in our interest, too, to help Ukraine get it back.
All right, Professor Yulia Joja from Georgetown, thank you so much. Fascinating to talk to you today. Well, coming up, Pope Leo XIV addresses the world's media for the first time. The pontiff's message and a surprise curveball in his meet and greet. We'll show you that when we come back. You're watching CBS News 24/7. Pope Leo XIV met with journalists today in the first press briefing of his papacy. Lots of people there taking pictures. He opened with a joke and ended with a blessing. CBS News foreign correspondent Chris Livesay has that story from Rome.
Thousands of reporters rose to their feet to welcome Pope Leo XIV in his first audience with the global media.
Buongiorno.
The world's only U.S.-born pontiff spoke in Italian, but broke the ice in English with a touch of humor.
They say when they clap at the beginning, it doesn't matter much. If you're still awake at the end and you still want to applaud, thank you very much.
Pope Leo called for the release of jailed journalists
Giornalisti incarcerati,
and said free speech and the media are a precious gift. The 69-year-old took time to shake hands, share smiles, and even sign a baseball in a nod to his Chicago roots and love for sports. Over the weekend, Pope Leo gave his first Sunday message here in St. Peter's Square, diving straight into global conflicts that he'll face as pontiff.
Mai più la guerra.
No more war, he said, urging a ceasefire in Gaza, the release of all hostages, and peace in Ukraine. Vatican expert Francis X. Roca says as the new pope navigates world conflicts, he's charting his own course.
Pope Francis, for example, said that the Ukrainians needed to wave the white flag. He made it clear that peace almost at any price was worth it to stop the war. Leo talked about just enduring an authentic peace.
As Pope Leo settles into his papacy, the world is watching to see how his influence will impact the course of history. Chris Livesay, CBS News, Rome.
We'll take you to California now, where Governor Gavin Newsom wants a cleanup of homeless encampments. Newsom will call on cities and counties to ban tent encampments from public property, including sidewalks, bike paths, and parks, and is going to release $3 billion in funds to do it. Keep an eye on that story. Plus, we'll have much more ahead right here on CBS News 24/7. The hometown of Edan Alexander there, celebrating the release of the last living American hostage by Hamas. We're going to follow what's next for him and others in the ceasefire talks. You're watching CBS News 24/7. Lindsay Reiser takes over.